Karen had always been the kind of person who lived for adventure. She wasn't the type to sit quietly in a cafe or spend hours reading books by the beach. No, Karen craved excitement, something that would make her heart race and give her stories to tell when she got back home. So when she decided to visit London, she knew it was going to be one of those trips where she pushed herself out of her comfort zone. And what better place to do that than Buckingham Palace? On a crisp morning, Karen stood among the sea of tourists outside the palace gates. The air buzzed with chatter as people snapped photos, pointing excitedly at the guards standing tall and still like statues. These royal guards were impossible to ignore. Their bright red uniforms caught the sunlight, and their towering bearskin hats made them look larger than life. Tourists laughed and whispered about how serious they looked, trying to get a reaction by waving or making funny faces. But the guards didn't flinch, not even once. Karen watched all of this with growing curiosity. There was something fascinating about how disciplined these men were. They stood there, unmoving, as if nothing could break their focus. It felt almost otherworldly. As her friends clicked pictures and admired the palace's grandeur, Karen's mind wandered. What would happen, she wondered, if someone actually tried to interact with them? Would they stay frozen forever, or was there some secret trigger that would snap them into action? Her thoughts began to spiral into mischief. "You know," she said suddenly, turning to her friends with a playful grin, "I bet I could grab that rifle before they even blink." Her words hung in the air for a moment, met with stunned silence. One of her friends, Sarah, frowned. "Are you serious? That's not a good idea, Karen. Those are real weapons. Plus, you're messing with security here." But Karen brushed off the warning. "Relax. It's just a joke," she said, rolling her eyes. "It's not like I'm gonna hurt anyone. I'll just touch it, and then we'll laugh about it later." Her confidence was infectious, and soon her group started teasing her, daring her to go through with it. Deep down, though, Karen wasn't entirely sure she'd follow through. It was all talk, for now. As the minutes ticked by, Karen found herself inching closer to the line between harmless fun and reckless behavior. She kept glancing at the nearest guard, studying his posture, wondering what he might do if provoked. Was he really as unmovable as he seemed, or was there a breaking point hidden beneath that stoic exterior? The more she thought about it, the more tempting the idea became. After all, how often did someone get the chance to test the limits of such an iconic symbol of tradition? Little did Karen know, her impulsive streak was about to lead her down a path she couldn't have imagined. What started as a lighthearted dare among friends was about to turn into something far bigger and much scarier than anything she'd ever experienced before. The days following Karen's arrest felt like a blur, but the public reaction was anything but hazy. News of her reckless stunts spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and social media feeds around the world. Tourist grabs guards' rifle at Buckingham Palace became a trending topic, sparking debates about respect for authority, cultural sensitivity, and personal accountability. Some people found humor in the situation, sharing memes and jokes online, while others were outraged, calling Karen irresponsible and selfish. The court of public opinion had spoken, and it wasn't kind. Karen's family hired a lawyer to help navigate the legal mess she'd landed in. Her charges included trespassing, theft of government property, and endangering public safety, serious offenses that could result in hefty fines or even jail time. Sitting across from her attorney in a cramped meeting room, Karen listened as he explained the potential consequences. "This isn't just about grabbing a rifle," he said gravely. "It's about violating protocols that exist to protect national security. People take these rules very seriously." As her case went to court, Karen prepared herself for judgment. She knew there was no excuse for what she'd done, but she hoped her remorse might soften the blow. On the day of her hearing, she stood before the judge, her voice trembling as she read a statement she'd written the night before. "I never intended to hurt anyone or disrespect the monarchy," she began, clutching a piece of paper so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I let my curiosity get the better of me, and I deeply regret my actions. I understand now how serious this is, and I promise to learn from my mistake." Her apology didn't sway everyone. Some spectators in the courtroom rolled their eyes, convinced her words were just an act to avoid punishment. Others whispered among themselves, questioning whether she truly understood the gravity of her actions. But not everyone dismissed her remorse outright. A few members of the public later commented online that they believed Karen deserved a second chance, especially since she appeared genuinely sorry. In the end, the judge decided on a plea deal. Instead of jail time, Karen was sentenced to community service and ordered to pay a fine. More importantly, she was required to issue a public apology and participate in educational programs aimed at teaching tourists about respecting cultural institutions. While the outcome could have been far worse, Karen left the courthouse feeling both relieved and humbled. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding trust would take time, and the memory of her mistake would linger long after the headlines faded. Back home, Karen struggled to adjust to life after the incident. Friends who once laughed at her boldness now seemed uneasy around her, unsure of what to say. Strangers recognized her name from news reports, sometimes glaring or making snide comments when they saw her in public. Even simple tasks like grocery shopping became nerve-wracking, as she constantly worried about being judged. But amid the isolation and shame, Karen also found moments of clarity. She realized that her actions hadn't just affected her. They had impacted countless others, from the guards who scrambled to respond to the tourists whose peaceful visit was disrupted. Determined to turn things around, Karen threw herself into fulfilling her community service requirements. She volunteered at local museums, helping organize exhibits and speaking to visitors about the importance of respecting boundaries, even in unfamiliar settings. At first, she dreaded reliving her story, but over time, she discovered a sense of purpose in sharing her experience. If her mistake could prevent someone else from making a similar error, then maybe not all hope was lost. Karen's journey toward redemption began in earnest when she started volunteering at a small museum near her hometown. It was a quiet, unassuming place filled with artifacts and exhibits that told stories of history, culture, and tradition. At first, Karen wasn't sure how she'd fit in or what value she could bring. She still carried the weight of her mistake, like an invisible anchor, unsure if anyone would trust her after what had happened. But as days turned into weeks, she found herself drawn to the work, not because it was glamorous, but because it gave her a chance to make amends. Her role involved guiding visitors through the museum, explaining the significance of the displays, and answering questions about the cultural practices they represented. It was during one of these tours that Karen first decided to share her story publicly. Standing in front of a group of curious tourists, she hesitated for a moment, her heart racing. "Before we move on," she said softly, "I want to tell you something personal." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Taking a deep breath, Karen recounted her fateful trip to Buckingham Palace, the impulsive decision, the chaos that followed, and the lessons she learned from the experience. To her surprise, the reaction was mixed but thoughtful. Some people nodded sympathetically, acknowledging that everyone makes mistakes. Others asked questions, wanting to understand why she'd acted so recklessly. One elderly woman approached her after the tour, placing a gentle hand on Karen's arm. "Thank you for sharing that," she said kindly. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, especially when the whole world is watching." Those words stayed with Karen long after the day ended, giving her a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could turn her misstep into something meaningful. As part of her plea agreement, Karen also wrote articles for travel blogs and local newspapers, offering advice to tourists on how to behave responsibly while visiting foreign landmarks. Her pieces were honest and heartfelt, blending humor with humility, as she urged readers to think twice before acting impulsively. "I used to think rules were just suggestions," she wrote in one article. "But I've learned that those rules exist for a reason, to protect not only the places we visit, but also the people who live there and the traditions they hold dear." Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Slowly but surely, Karen began to rebuild her reputation. Local schools invited her to speak to students about accountability and respecting boundaries, using her story as a cautionary tale. Parents appreciated her candor, and teachers praised her willingness to confront her past head-on. For Karen, these interactions became a source of healing. Each time someone thanked her for her honesty or admitted they'd learned something new, she felt a little less burdened by guilt. Still, forgiveness wasn't universal. Online trolls continued to criticize her, dredging up old news articles and mocking her attempts at redemption. Some accused her of seeking attention, while others dismissed her efforts as insincere. At first, the negativity stung deeply, but over time, Karen learned to tune it out. She reminded herself that she couldn't control what others thought, but she could control how she responded. And every positive interaction, no matter how small, reinforced her belief that change was possible. By embracing her role as an advocate for responsible tourism, Karen discovered a newfound sense of purpose. What had once been a source of shame became a platform for growth. She realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and striving to do better. As she stood in front of another group of visitors at the museum one afternoon, smiling despite the nerves, she felt a quiet pride knowing she was helping others avoid the same pitfalls she'd faced. For the first time in a long while, Karen believed she was on the right path. The calm of the palace courtyard shattered in an instant. The moment Karen's fingers touched the rifle, it was as if she had triggered a hidden switch. Alarms blared loudly, sharp and jarring, slicing through the peaceful atmosphere like a knife. Tourists who had been casually snapping photos or admiring the guards froze in confusion before panic set in. People began to scatter, some clutching their cameras, others grabbing their children's hands, unsure of what was happening but certain they needed to get away. Karen stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. Her friends, who had been standing nearby, were now backing away, their faces pale with fear. "Karen, don't move," one of them shouted, but she barely heard them over the chaos around her. Uniformed officers seemed to appear out of nowhere, sprinting toward her with determined strides. Their boots thudded against the cobblestones, each step echoing like thunder in the suddenly tense air. Within seconds, Karen was surrounded. The guards' earlier stoic expressions were gone, replaced by cold, professional focus. One officer barked commands at her, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Hands where we can see them. Do not move." Karen obeyed immediately, raising her hands high above her head. Her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't supposed to be serious. It was just a joke, wasn't it? But the looks on the officers' faces told her otherwise. There was no room for humor here, only protocol. As more security personnel arrived, tourists pressed against the barriers, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the commotion. Some pulled out their phones, filming the scene while whispering speculations. "What did she do?" One woman asked nervously. "I think she grabbed a guard's gun," another replied. Her tone laced with disbelief. The once magical aura of Buckingham Palace had transformed into something tense and intimidating, all because of Karen's impulsive decision. The officers moved quickly, surrounding her in a tight circle. One of them stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. "Do you understand the severity of your actions?" he demanded, his eyes locked onto hers. Karen nodded rapidly, her voice trembling as she tried to explain. I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a stupid joke. I didn't think." But the officer cut her off sharply. "That's the problem. You didn't think." The gravity of the situation hit Karen like a tidal wave. She glanced around, hoping to find some sign of leniency, some indication that this could still be resolved without serious consequences. Instead, she saw only stern faces and unwavering determination. The guards weren't just protecting themselves. They were safeguarding centuries of tradition, discipline, and national pride. To them, Karen wasn't just a reckless tourist. She was a threat to everything they represented. As the officers began escorting her away, Karen caught a final glimpse of her friends. They stood frozen, wide-eyed and helpless, unable to intervene. She wanted to call out to them, to apologize for dragging them into this mess, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could do was follow the officers, her legs shaking with every step. The cheerful morning she'd envisioned when she woke up felt like a distant memory now. In its place was a sinking realization. She had made a mistake, a big one. And there was no turning back. Years after the infamous day at Buckingham Palace, Karen's name was still tied to that headline, but not in the way it once had been. What started as a story of recklessness and embarrassment evolved into one of growth, accountability, and resilience. Karen embraced her past, no longer seeing it as a scar she needed to hide, but as a chapter that defined her journey. She became a voice for responsible tourism, sharing her experience with audiences far beyond her hometown. Her talks grew in popularity, drawing crowds at travel conventions, schools, and community events. Karen's presentations were engaging and heartfelt, blending humor with hard truths. She began each session by admitting her mistake openly. "I grabbed a Royal Guards rifle, not because I wanted to cause trouble, but because I thought it would be funny." Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The audience would laugh nervously, easing into the topic before she dove deeper, explaining the ripple effects of her actions. She didn't sugarcoat anything. Instead, she painted a vivid picture of the chaos, fear, and regret she felt that day. Her honesty struck a chord with listeners, leaving them both entertained and reflective. Karen also expanded her advocacy work online, creating videos and blog posts that reached travelers around the world. Her content went beyond simple do's and don'ts. It encouraged people to think critically about their behavior when visiting foreign places. Before you act, she often wrote, ask yourself, would this disrupt or disrespect anyone? If the answer is yes, step back. Her message resonated widely, earning praise from educators, historians, and even former critics who once dismissed her as irresponsible. One museum curator even called her efforts a gift to the global travel community. Though Karen had come a long way, there were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, scrolling through old news articles or hearing whispers about her past, she sometimes wondered if she'd ever truly escaped the shadow of that day. But those doubts only fueled her determination to keep moving forward. She reminded herself that redemption wasn't about erasing history, it was about rewriting its ending. And every time someone approached her after a talk to say they'd learned something valuable, Karen knew she was doing just that. One of the most rewarding aspects of her transformation was reconnecting with the very institution she'd once disrespected. Through her advocacy work, Karen caught the attention of cultural preservation organizations, including some linked to Buckingham Palace itself. They invited her to speak at workshops designed to educate tourists about respecting historic landmarks. Standing before an audience in London years later, Karen couldn't help but smile wistfully. "I never imagined I'd be standing here again under these circumstances," she admitted. But life has a funny way of giving us second chances, if we're willing to take them. As time passed, Karen's story became less about the mistake itself and more about what came after. It served as a powerful reminder that everyone stumbles, but how we rise matters more than how we fall. Parents used her example to teach their children about consequences. Teachers incorporated her lessons into their classrooms, and travelers carried her advice wherever they went. Even the royal guards, stoic as ever, occasionally heard whispers of her tale during training sessions, a lighthearted yet sobering anecdote about why rules exist. In the end, Karen realized that her misstep hadn't defined her. It had redirected her. Where once she sought thrills for the sake of excitement, she now found purpose in making a difference. She often reflected on how close she'd come to losing everything, and how grateful she was to have turned it all around. Life, she decided, wasn't about avoiding mistakes, it was about learning from them. And Karen had done exactly that, transforming a reckless moment into a lifetime of meaningful impact. The inside of the police station was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the vibrant energy of Buckingham Palace just hours earlier. Karen sat on a hard wooden bench in a small, dimly lit room, her hands clasped tightly together to stop them from trembling. The officers had taken her there without saying much, their expressions unreadable but their intentions clear. This was serious business. For the first time in her life, Karen felt truly alone. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she waited for someone to speak to her. Her mind raced with questions. What would happen next? Would she be sent to jail? Would her family have to fly out to London to bail her out? Every possible scenario seemed worse than the last. She tried to distract herself by focusing on the details of the room. The peeling paint on the walls, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. But nothing could quiet the storm brewing inside her head. Finally, the door creaked open, and two officers entered. One carried a folder, while the other held a notepad. They introduced themselves briefly before diving straight into questioning. "Let's start from the beginning," one of them said firmly, pulling up a chair across from her. "Why did you touch the guard's rifle?" Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry. I wasn't thinking," she stammered. "It was supposed to be. I don't know, funny. A silly thing to do for a laugh." She glanced at their faces, hoping for even a flicker of understanding, but found none. Their expressions remained neutral, almost robotic, as if they'd heard every excuse in the book. The interrogation continued relentlessly. They asked about her background, her intentions, whether she had any connection to groups that might pose a threat. Each question felt heavier than the last, piling guilt onto Karen until she thought she might collapse under its weight. No, I swear," she insisted when they pressed her about ulterior motives. "I'm just a tourist. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Despite her pleas, the officers showed no signs of letting up. They reviewed security footage, cross-referenced witness statements, and contacted higher authorities to determine how severe her breach really was. Karen sat silently through it all, feeling smaller and more powerless with each passing minute. The playful confidence she shown earlier outside the palace felt like a distant memory now, replaced by overwhelming regret. At one point, an officer left the room, returning with a printed copy of the rules posted near the palace gates. He placed it in front of her, pointing to a line that explicitly stated visitors must not interfere with royal guards or their equipment. "Did you see this?" he asked, his tone sharp. Karen shook her head slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't read it," she admitted softly. "I wasn't paying attention." Her admission only seemed to confirm their suspicions. The officers exchanged glances, then resumed jotting notes. Karen couldn't tell if they believed her or thought she was lying, but it didn't matter. She already felt defeated. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion began to set in. Her initial burst of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep ache in her chest. She realized she wasn't just facing legal consequences. She was grappling with the shame of knowing she'd let herself, and everyone around her, down. By the time the questioning ended, Karen was emotionally drained. She was escorted to a holding cell, where she would wait until further decisions were made. Sitting on the narrow cot, staring at the blank walls, she replayed the day's events over and over in her mind. How had everything gone so wrong? And more importantly, how would she ever make it right? Karen's heart pounded as she took a step closer to the guard. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard, and the chatter of tourists faded into the background. Her friends were still nearby, watching nervously, unsure if she was actually going to go through with her bold claim. Karen hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder to see their wide-eyed expressions. "You guys are gonna owe me big time for this," she joked, trying to sound confident despite the knot forming in her stomach. The guard stood only a few feet away now, his posture rigid and unwavering. His rifle rested against his shoulder, gleaming faintly under the sunlight. To Karen, it looked almost like a prop, something out of a movie set rather than a real weapon. She shook her head slightly, reminding herself that this wasn't Hollywood. Still, the thrill of doing something so daring was intoxicating. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong move could send everything spiraling, but also knowing you might just pull it off. Taking a deep breath, Karen reached out her hand. Time seemed to slow down as her fingers brushed against the cold metal of the rifle. For a split second, nothing happened. The guard didn't flinch. No alarms blared. The world around her remained eerily silent. A wave of exhilaration washed over Karen, and she couldn't help but grin. "See, told you it'd be fine," she said, turning back toward her friends with a triumphant look. But before anyone could respond, chaos erupted. A sharp whistle pierced the air, followed by the sound of boots pounding against the ground. Suddenly, Karen realized her mistake. This wasn't just some harmless prank. It was a breach of protocol, an act that had consequences far beyond what she'd anticipated. Panic surged through her veins as she quickly let go of the rifle, stepping back with her hands raised instinctively. "Wait, I didn't mean anything by it," she stammered, her voice trembling. But her words were drowned out by shouts from uniformed officers rushing toward her. Her friends froze in shock, unsure whether to intervene or stay put. One of them called out, "Karen, just stop moving." But their advice came too late. Within moments, Karen was surrounded by stern-faced guards, their expressions devoid of humor or patience. Their earlier stoicism had vanished, replaced by an intensity that sent chills down her spine. She looked around frantically, searching for any sign of reassurance, but all she saw were hard eyes and clenched jaws. As the situation escalated, Karen's mind raced. What had she been thinking? Why hadn't she listened to Sarah's warning? Now, instead of laughing about her silly stunt, she was facing something far more serious. The weight of her actions hit her like a ton of bricks. She wanted to explain, to tell them it was all a joke, but the words caught in her throat. All she could do was stand there, frozen, as the reality of her impulsive decision began to sink in. For the first time in her life, Karen truly understood what it meant to cross a line. And as the guards closed in, she realized there would be no easy way out of this mess. Months passed, and Karen's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The chaos of her arrest and the media storm that followed had faded, leaving behind a quieter existence, but one that was far richer in perspective. She returned to her hometown with a suitcase full of lessons learned and a heart determined to move forward. While she avoided talking about her infamous day at Buckingham Palace, unless absolutely necessary, privately, Karen reflected deeply on how close she'd come to ruining her life. Her days were now filled with volunteer work at museums, community centers and schools, where she shared her story as a cautionary tale. At first, it felt strange to stand in front of strangers and admit to such a reckless act, but over time, Karen grew more comfortable. She realized that vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was a bridge to connection. People listened intently as she described the moment she reached for the guard's rifle, the panic that followed, and the long road to redemption. Her honesty resonated with many, especially young travelers who admitted they often underestimated the importance of respecting cultural norms. Karen also found solace in smaller, everyday moments. She started journaling, pouring her thoughts onto paper as a way to process everything she'd been through. Writing became a form of therapy, helping her untangle the emotions she still carried: guilt, regret, fear, but also gratitude. Gratitude for the second chance she'd been given, for the people who had supported her, and for the opportunity to turn her mistake into something positive. Some evenings, she'd sit by her window, penning letters to herself or jotting down ideas for future talks. It was during these quiet hours that Karen truly began to heal. Despite her progress, reminders of her past lingered. Social media algorithms occasionally surfaced old posts about her incident, and news outlets sometimes revisited the story on slow news days. Each time, Karen felt a pang of anxiety, worried that the world would never let her forget. But instead of letting it paralyze her, she chose to confront it head-on. "I can't change what happened," she told herself firmly one night after seeing yet another headline pop up online. "But I can control how I respond." Her friends noticed the shift in her too. Gone was the carefree, impulsive Karen who lived for thrills without considering consequences. In her place was someone more grounded, thoughtful, and empathetic. Sarah, her closest friend from the trip, once remarked, "You're different now. Not in a bad way, though. You seem wiser." Karen smiled at the comment, knowing there was truth in it. The experience had forced her to grow up quickly, teaching her that actions always carry weight, even when you don't intend them to. One of the most transformative aspects of Karen's journey was her newfound passion for educating others. She collaborated with travel organizations to create brochures and videos highlighting the do's and don'ts of visiting historic sites. These materials emphasized not just rules but the reasons behind them, the history, the symbolism, the pride that communities took in preserving their heritage. When tourists approached her at the museum asking questions, Karen didn't just recite facts. She encouraged them to think critically about their role as visitors. Respect isn't just about following rules, she'd say. It's about understanding why those rules matter. By the end of her first year back home, Karen felt like a different person. The weight of her mistake hadn't disappeared entirely, but it no longer crushed her. Instead, it served as a constant reminder of how fragile trust could be and how precious it was once regained. As she stood in front of another group of wide-eyed students one afternoon, answering their curious questions with patience and grace, Karen realized she was finally at peace. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught her something invaluable. Even the biggest mistakes could lead to growth, if you were brave enough to face them.